do one webinar every month on a topic, and you can't get any more timely than corn silage. Dr. Luiz Ferraretto is leading our discussion today, and he is originally from Brazil, was an associate professor of livestock nutrition at the University of Florida, and now is at UW-Madison. Luiz's research and extension interests are applied ruminant nutrition and management, with a focus on improving starch and fiber utilization of dairy cows, corn silage, and high moisture corn quality and digestibility. We are very tickled to have you here talking with us. Some of the folks may have heard the podcast we did a week ago, but at this point, welcome to the webcast. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred, for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here today and discussing my favorite topic, of course, corn silage. So it's always a pleasure. I agree with you. It's a very timely topic, and a topic that actually was very tricky for us this year, because we always try to predict what the crop will be. And let's be honest, right? At least from my perspective, I never predict well. So we have some ideas and then we discuss. And actually, I had a very interesting case this year, because I was asked to write a short article discussing harvesting practice and how to improve nutritive value of corn silage 2 months ago. And then I wrote and I submitted that. And 2 weeks later, we had that week where the drought period started and everything got very dry. And my first thought during that time is everything I mentioned in that specific article will be very likely useless, right? But then after that, we started getting rain again, and the crop got better than expected, at least better than what we thought it would be during the period. And I believe some of those discussions came back to be important and of consideration for those of you harvesting silage. So when I think about silage, I think there are many things we have to consider, which makes very tricky to define, okay, so what are the most important practices that we have to always pay attention or, emphasize? So when thinking about that, I decided to go through and discuss, or at least introduce to you, a couple of harvesting strategies that play a major role on corn silage nutritive value. And from there, we're going to highlight a little bit the use of those strategies and discuss why they are important, try to show, economically, why do we care about some of those numbers, and move on from there. So if you think about corn silage, we think often as a unique feed ingredient to ruminant diets, because first, he offers us this green portion here that is basically the forage portion, right? That's why we feed corn silage or corn plants, if you will, because the forage portion is actually very nutritive. It provides a lot of NDF and obviously physically effective fiber. But in addition to that, whole plant corn silage is this yellow fraction, or the kernels, which provide a lot of starch, right? So the combination of the corn plant and kernels actually make a very appealing feed ingredient for us to feed. However, we have to remember that sometimes the practice that's best for one is not the best for the other, right? Although there are specific harvesting practices that actually improve both at the same time. So if you think about that, let's discuss a little bit about the yellow fraction first. So if you think about the corn kernel or the starch portion of corn silage, basically, when we go through published literature, we see that cows fed corn silage-based diets have actually a lot of variation in starch digestibility in their total tract. Variation is I'm highlighting here 80 to 100%, but actually there are trials that are a little bit lower than that. Of course, this is not very usual, but still something to be considered. And if you think about that, it actually makes sense to have this type of variation because there are so many factors that affect starch digestibility within the corn plant or within those different strategies that we apply during harvest and storage of silage that we have to consider. So here is just a short list of items. And in my opinion, those are the most important items and in the order that I deem them to be important. And I think that those are key to make sure we do a good job feeding cows with corn silage. So obviously I highlighted kernel particle size first, and I will try to justify the choice of kernel particle size in a couple of slides, because to me, you have to make sure you break kernels very well, right? The starch is inside those kernels and we have to expose them. Today, we're not gonna discuss this topic heavily, but durational silage fermentation is another practice that have been gaining popularity. And actually we know today that the longer silage ferments, more digestible the starch gets. After that, there is kernel maturity, which actually is key right now because we have to define when to harvest, and kernel maturity plays a major role, not only to define when to harvest, but obviously maturity at harvest change the digestibility of starch. And then we also highlight endosperm properties and additives. We won't be discussing those. And in my opinion, those two areas are less important than the other three that we highlight. If we shift towards the, back towards the green fraction here, or the corn stover fraction, here we are not highlighting the dairy cow or a ruminant animal digestion. We are highlighting the digestibility in vitro. Okay, that's the one that we analyze in the lab. We put a sample inside rumen fluid and then measure NDF that goes in and the NDF that is remaining after the incubation. And the variation is actually also very high. And this shouldn't be surprising because different corn plants, they will change in, they will differ in lignin as well as NDF concentration. And basically, lignin is what inhibits NDF digestion, right? Even though lignin is extremely important to the corn plant, excessive levels of, or greater levels of lignin decrease digestibility of NDF. And some of the things that we know today that affect that are hybrid type, which we will not be discussing today because you already chose your hybrid. So we're gonna go with what you have instead of discussing the hybrid. And then maturity at harvest again, and very similar to starch, maturity at harvest plays a major role in digestibility of fiber. And we're gonna show some data related to that soon. And then after that, we have additives, which are not gonna show, okay? You may be wondering, well, Luis, there are other factors, right, that affect fiber digestibility, like cutting height, for example. And yes, if you're wondering that, you're absolutely right. Cutting height play a major role. We are not discussing that today because what we have been hearing is that people may be short in inventory this year, so cutting height may not be the option, right? Because if you increase cutting height, obviously you will be leaving extra material in the field, so your yields are lower. So we decide to don't discuss that today, but if by any chance you have any questions, we would be happy to discuss that at the end of the presentation. So coming back to the kernel fraction, here we have a simple picture of a whole kernel and a kernel cut in half. And the reason why I'm showing that today is I'm a nutritionist. So when I see a corn kernel, the first thing I think is food for cattle, right? The energy that I will provide to those animals. But in reality, if you think about the corn kernel, it is a seed, right? So there is a very well elaborated structure to protect what is inside in order to make sure it works as a seed. So if you think about the structure of the corn kernel, you will see that we have a very wide fraction right in the middle of the kernel, which we call endosperm. This is primarily the flory endosperm. This is a very digestible starch. Okay, starch is white. We like seeing yellow corn, but actually the nicest part of corn kernel from an animal nutrition perspective is the white part inside the kernels, which is the starch there. Right next to it, you can see that there is still the endosperm, but there is a slightly more yellowish portion. This is the vitreous endosperm. The vitreous endosperm contain starch, but also contain some proteins that we name prolamine proteins. For corn, we actually call them zinc proteins. And those proteins, actually, they are surrounding the starch granules, and they make starch less digestible. Okay, so this will be important in a couple of minutes. So that's why I'm introducing the protein side at this time. And then after that, we have around the seed a fraction that we call pericarp. Okay, that's the hardest part of the kernel. That's the hull of the corn grain, and that's what it protects it. So basically, if you think about the pericarp inside a cow rumen, basically it will inhibit bacterial attachment and will inhibit enzymes of reaching the starch and digesting the starch. So because of that, if you have a lot of intact kernels, it makes very difficult to have a full digestion. So some years ago, we ran a study. This was during the time I was in grad school. And basically, we had a group of students working in this project. I was just helping with that. And basically, what they did was they grabbed approximately 100 different hybrids, kernels from 100 different hybrids that Dr. Shaver had stored over the years. And then what they did is they separate 3 kernels per hybrid, and then for each of those different particle size. So basically, they had approximately 300 kernels, and then they start cutting those. They kept whole, or then they cut into 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64 pieces. Okay, so basically they went through a lot of trouble to cut all those kernels, because they had to do that with scalpels, because we wanted to make sure that those particles were very similar in size without breaking those kernels. So, you know, during the time they were doing that, I always thought, man, why are they going through so much work, right, to cut these kernels, all those different particle size? But actually, what they did is very important, because it's a very nice showcase of the importance of breaking kernels. So after they cut all those kernels, they put those kernels inside nylon bags, and nylon bags inside the rumen of a dairy cow. We had some kind of lady cows to work with. And they let it there for 3, 6, 12, or 24 hours. And after that, they remove it and wash it, and we measure dry matter digestibility. Okay. In this particular case, because we use only kernels, the dry matter digestibility is very well correlated with starch digestibility. So we can consider that the pattern of digestion is very similar. Okay, maybe the numbers would be a little bit different, but the pattern is exactly the same. So if we begin with the whole kernels, which is the blue line, you will see that over time, the digestion of those kernels actually remain very low. And as you start progressing from whole to 2 or to 4, 8, and so forth, you see that digestibility starts to increase, right? So basically what's going on here is the pericarp inhibits digestion. The more you break those kernels, more areas of entrance for bacteria and enzymes to reach that starch becomes available, and consequently kernels become more digestible. But then you may be thinking, Luis, you mentioned that you had kernels stored. You never said that those were silage, right? You're absolutely right if you're asking that, because these were kernels at silage maturity, but they were not fermented, right? So those were unfermented kernels. And if you understand a little bit of silage fermentation, you know that bacteria in the silo, they release some proteases that break down those prolamine proteins I mentioned earlier in the vitreous endosperm of corn and break them down. When those prolamine proteins are broken, starch becomes available and starch digestibility increase. And that's why we suggest that longer storage periods increases starch digestibility. So basically that's what this graph shows. So if you think about silage fermentation and starch digestibility, you see that early during the fermentation process, let's say early 15 to 45 days, okay, there is a boost in starch digestibility, right? There is actually a spike. And then after that, starch digestibility continues to increase because bacteria activity continues to happen. at a smaller scale, of course, because you reach a more stable pH. So the increase in starch digestibility is gradual, but not as pronounced, right? So obviously, the unfermented kernels that I showed in the previous study, they didn't have this benefit here. For those of you who used to work with corn silage, you also know that the corn kernels, after some time inside the silo, they are not as hard as they are before going there, right? Because fermentation makes them softer. And this is important because a lot of times cows will masticate those kernels, and then some of the starch can be digested. That's why you never have such a low starch digestibility total tract, as I demonstrated with that particular study. But thinking about that, we have been running a lot of studies trying to understand fermentation and starch digestibility, and we came up with the following question. We know that there is a benefit of starch digestibility with fermentation, but we also know the bacteria in the rumen cannot truly attach to kernels and release their enzymes to break down those prolamine proteins and to break down starch. So why this would be possible in the silo? We just didn't know, right? So basically, we designed a study to learn about that. And what we did was we had a whole plant corn, and before harvesting, we actually grabbed those plants and we separated the forage fraction and the kernels. And then we passed the forage fraction through a stationary harvester. And then we shell all the corn kernels and we separated them into a portion that we would keep intact and another portion where we smashed them one by one. And the reason why we smashed them is we wanted to make sure we open the pericarp and have access, but we didn't break down a lot of the particle size because we knew the particle size changes the starch digestibility. After we smash all those kernels, we mix either intact or broken kernels with the forage fraction, and we ensilo them in mini silos. And then we let them ferment for 30 days. After fermented for 30 days, we separated those kernels again, just to analyze the kernels and understand. So the intact kernels, do they improve in starch digestibility during fermentation the same way that broken kernels do? And our hypothesis was that no, because if bacteria cannot attach to those kernels in the rumen, why would they be able to do that in the silo? And somehow we were actually right about that to a certain extent, right? So basically, if you go through this table, what we have here is silage that had intact kernels at 0 day, which is non-fermented, or at 30 days, which is those silos that we put together. And then we have exactly the same thing for the silage that had broken kernels. So the first thing we measured was soluble protein and ammonia nitrogen, because we know that the prolamine proteins will be degraded in the silo, and when they are broken down, basically increase soluble protein and ammonia nitrogen. And what we saw actually was the intact kernels had more ammonia and increased soluble protein concentration. So our first thought is, well, probably starch digestibility is not gonna be good because it looks like the indicators for nitrogen are against us. But then we measure in vitro starch digestibility, which is this last row, and what we saw was fermentation did not improve digestibility of starch in intact kernels, but fermentation improved starch digestibility if the kernels were broken, right? Luiz, is this always the case? I don't think this is always the case, but I think this is an initial indication that broken kernels may be not important only because they are more digestible, because particles are more accessible, but also because the benefit of the silage on starch digestibility is more pronounced. Okay, in this case, was not pronounced at all for the intact kernels. And I guess that explains why this specific industry project show a very strong relationship between fecal starch and kernel processing score. So if you're not familiarized with that, kernel processing score or corn silage processing score is an assay where we collect the corn silage sample, we dry, we pass through multiple sieves, and then we measure starch above and below the 4.75 millimeter sieve. The reason why we use that sieve is because theoretically, that sieve separates kernels that are broken in 4 pieces. So the greater amount of starch passing through the sieve means that you have more kernels broken in at least 4 pieces, right? And obviously, fecal starch is just a concentration of starch in the manure. So theoretically, it's the starch that was not digested in the rumen or intestine of cattle. So basically, in this particular study, a lot of samples were collected across multiple dairies in different states in the United States. And basically, there's a very strong relationship between corn silage processing score and fecal starch. The greatest the corn silage processing score, the lowest the fecal starch. Or in other words, more broken kernels, less starch lost in the manure. And using this particular samples, we ran a simple equation to try to predict fecal starch based on corn silage processing score, just to run an exercise here. And I will be upfront with you here. These are simulations, okay? And you will see that the corn grain price I'm using here is unreal, right? It's definitely not what you pay today. But I thought it would be very unfair to use today prices because I would easily prove my point, right? We have to use normal prices to try to understand what is the true importance of that. So in this particular scenario, we will consider a dairy cow consuming a diet of 25% starch. And then dry matter intake is 55 pounds per cow per day. For this particular exercise, we will assume that all the starch is coming from the corn silage, okay? But in order to understand the importance of digestible starch in corn silage, we will add to the diet corn grain to fulfill the starch that's lost in the manure. In order to do that, I have to assume the corn grain has 70% starch, or in other words, 1 pound of corn adds 0.7 pounds of starch, and that the digestibility of that starch is also 70%. So each pound of corn extra means that I'm adding 0.5 pounds of digestible starch, okay? And here's the price that I use, $140 per ton. So we are assuming here 3 very arbitrary scenarios. 30% corn silage processing score, which is very low, 55, that's below average, and 80%, that is a little bit above average, so outstanding, okay? That's how we're gonna call that. If we know that the cow consumed 55 pounds of dry matter per day, and starch was 25% of the diet dry matter, basically means that that cow consumed almost 14 pounds of starch. And then using the regression created with that particular data set from Bremen and Kurtz, we predicted a fecal starch of 8.4, 4.65, and 0.9 for these 3 scenarios. Dr. Shaver and his group created a fecal starch equation some years ago, and that's what we use to predict total tract starch digestibility. So basically, we use this equation here, the fecal starch values that we just predicted, and we know total tract starch digestibility. If I know how much starch the cow consumed, and I know the percentage of that starch that was digested, I know what is lost in the manure, right? So that's what we calculated here, starch loss. And if you remember, I mentioned that for each pound of starch that's lost in the manure, I would add corn to replace it. But because corn only has half a pound of digestible starch per pound, I have to add 2 pounds of corn per each pound of starch lost in the manure. And then I calculated the prices that you may be losing if your corn silage processing score have those different values, okay? Obviously, I don't expect you to have beyond 80% corn silage processing score, okay? But I think it's very important to go through exercises like this to have an idea of, okay, if I had to replace what I'm actually losing, how much extra would I spend? And obviously, again, I use prices that are not today's reality, but I thought it would be unfair to use today's reality to calculate this scenario. So basically, the question that arises, how do we obtain excellent processing, right? And there's only one way. I don't know another way of doing that. Adequate and constant monitoring in the field. you have to look through your samples. You have to. There's no other way. Okay, and you can see that here we have a very poorly processed on the left and a very well processed on the right. So if you pay attention to kernels, you can clearly see those. But there is a tricky thing, right? When we look to the corn silage sample, sometimes the material looks very good, but because there is a lot of forage particles within a corn silage sample that do not allow you to see the whole picture, right? So some years ago, Shinners and Holmes put together this extension paper describing this methodology that actually I like very much because it works very well on farm. And basically what they do is they get a bucket with water, a handful sample of corn silage. They put the silage in water. They gently agitate for less than a minute. And what happens is the kernels, they are much heavier than the fiber. So the kernels will sink and the fiber will float. So after you gently agitate, you can remove the fiber from the top of the bucket. You can remove the water and you end up with corn kernels. So if you pay close attention to those kernels, you will see if you have intact kernels or not, okay? You may call me a radical, but I like seeing no intact kernels. Luiz, are you suggesting we should have no intact kernels? No, I think each dairy or each beef operation have to develop their own index for that. But I think you have to make sure you break as many kernels as possible. And I think this method helps a lot to see those numbers, okay? Luiz, how often do you suggest doing that? I actually think that ideally, and I know the ideally is not always accomplished, every load. Okay, and but every load is a lot, it's a lot of work. And sometimes we don't have the time doing that during harvest season because there's a lot going on at the dairy or at our operation. And yes, you're absolutely right. This is the case. But the reason why I suggest every load is depending how fast and how many trucks you have bringing silage from the field to the bunkers or bags, whatever you use to ensile those. Maybe when you look the first load, there are 5, sometimes 10 other loads coming that were already harvested. So there is no way you can change that anymore, right? So if you keep track of multiple loads or every other load, you have time to stop, adjust the harvester, try to be more aggressive and break more kernels. So my first take-home message for you is break more kernels. But then there's another very important factor that actually affects kernel breakage, but affects many other things, which is maturity at harvest. Obviously, this year is a very tricky year to determine the best maturity because first, if you had some drought-stressed corn, sometimes the plants look drier than they really are. Another thing that happens is maybe you have fields or sections within a field that are drier than other sections, right? So what do you do? Well, my suggestion is the same way as the corn kernels, constant monitoring of those, right? My suggestion is collect samples from multiple areas within a field and across multiple fields for dry matter, okay? So you can have an idea on how dry those are. Another thing that I think is very important to go through is go through corn kernels, check the kernel milk line. A lot of times hybrids, they don't have a nice relationship between dry matter and kernel milk line. So my suggestion is pay attention to both so you can make a better decision. But Luiz, why maturity is so important to corn silage? So remember when I mentioned the vitreous endosperm, which is the starch portion of the kernel, but that had those prolonging proteins surrounding starch and inhibiting its digestion. So if you go through literature, and you pay attention to kernel vitreousness is the proportion of vitreous endosperm in relation to the flory endosperm. So vitreous less digestible starch, flory more digestible starch. As maturity progresses, and here maturity we are measuring as kernel dry matter concentration, you will see that the vitreousness of those kernels, they increase, right? So if you think about that, basically what happens is as maturity progresses, those kernels, they get harder and harder. And this is very important because it makes the job of breaking kernels much harder. So this is another review we put together some years ago And basically what we saw was the total tract starch digestibility by dairy cows change by using processed and unprocessed harvesters. And here I'm not trying to prove a point about processors. Okay, I just wanted to show what maturity does to the efficacy of the processing. Okay, in my opinion, I think processor is key, right? You have to have a cracker and preferably very tight to make sure you break as many corn kernels as possible. So basically, if you pay attention here, you see that for silage samples that had less than 28% dry matter, the processor was not that effective, right? Because the kernels are so soft that they will be broken anyway, right? True for 28 and 32% as well. For the record, I think you should always use a processor. So I'm not going to say here that there is no effect. Okay, luckily, we saw those effects with this review, but you have to make sure those are truly broken. As you move from 32 and maybe up to 40% dry matter, you can see the processed silage is much more digestible than unprocessed silage, which means that more broken kernels are more digestible than less broken kernels. But as you move back to more than 40% dry matter, you can see that processing is not as efficient as it is before you reach that maturity level. Okay, and this is very important because sometimes there is no way we can go to the field before we reach that maturity. So we need to make sure we know that we have to go an extra mile to break those kernels, right? So sometimes you have to make adjustments to have even tighter row gap settings and shorter particle size, respecting the fact that you need to harvest physically effective fiber, of course. Okay? Another interesting factor about maturity is that it changed the fiber portion of the plant. So here's a study conducted at Florida, okay, but there are multiple studies in multiple locations that show exactly the same scenario. Okay? In this case, they had multiple hybrids, and basically they planted during the summer, and they had 4 main target maturities: 30, 35, 40, and 45% dry matter. And what they learned with that particular study was if you wait longer to harvest, you will very likely increase the starch concentration, which is very important, but you will reduce in vitro NDF digestibility. Okay, and if you pay close attention here, you may think, well, Luiz, but there are 4, maybe 5% units. This is probably not important enough. I will show you in a second that actually it is very important, okay, because those are average and there's a lot of variation involved. Okay, so when we calculate the milk per ton from the milk 2006, you can see that the X-ray starch do not really compensate for the lack of digestibility. Okay, so you have a decrease if you wait too long to harvest. That's why harvest time is so important. Okay? So just to explain to you, why do I consider that few percentage units change so important? So many years ago, Oben Allen put together this review, and what they saw was that for every 1% unit increase in NDF digestibility, either in vitro or in situ, cows have potential to consume 0.4 pounds of dry matter more per day. And this is very important because greater consumption, greater energy intake, greater milk production, which is also reflected here with the potential to produce 0.55 pounds per day more for each percentage unit increase. So Luiz, if I increase a little bit digestibility, I get 2 pounds per day. No, obviously not, right? That's the potential. But if you feed more digestible fiber, especially early and peak lactation cows, there is way more potential to improve performance. And then after that, in 2010, Jung and co-authors run a similar review, and basically they only used diets that had more than 40% corn silage, and they saw similar numbers, right? So basically forage NDF is actually very, very important. So we do have to be very careful with that, okay? Recently, we actually learned that there is more to fiber digestibility than intake. So we were preparing a review, and we decided to understand fiber digestibility using 2 very different crops, corn silage and sorghum silage. For those of you that work with sorghum, you know that sorghum is typically has lower fiber digestibility than corn, right? Except if you're using BMR sorghum, right? But if you use conventional corn versus conventional sorghum, sorghum has a slightly lower fiber digestibility. So all those 4 studies compare diets containing corn silage and diets containing sorghum silage, both conventional. And basically here data is presented as percentage of intake the cows consuming the sorghum-based silage had compared to the corn silage. So basically, if you use the first experiment as an example, 88.3% of the intake for sorghum compared to corn. So basically, there is a, let's say, 5 to 15% decrease in intake when you feed less digestible material. But if you pay attention to eating time, and if you think about eating time, is not just the time the cows spend eating, okay? Researchers somehow have those crazy thoughts, and sometimes they don't name things perfectly, okay? I'm not criticizing whoever creates this metric, but eating time often means the time that the cow spend at the feed bank. So the cow could be sorting, masticating, or truly eating, okay? But you can see that the cows that eat a less digestible fiber spend between 5 and 20% longer in the feed bank than those other cows. And if you're thinking about that, those cows are very likely not resting during that extra time, right? Now, related to forages, we also saw that there is a negative relationship between eating time and performance. Okay, those are arbitrary values, so we're not going to go through those. But at the end of the day, it's very clear to me that if the cow spends a lot of time in the feed bank, she's likely doing something other than eat during this extra time, probably sorting for whatever she wants to find there that may be what she needs. Okay, so keep that in mind. Fiber digestibility is very important for intake, but actually change cow behavior to a completely different extent. And the last part about the importance of corn silage maturity is its fermentation, right? Even though silage harvests at late maturity, or more than 40% dry matter, if you will, can ferment very, very well, this graph clearly shows that the more you wait to harvest, the more dry matter the plant accumulates, less pronounced the fermentation is. So if you look to the blue line here, you see that it's pH. And as your maturity progresses, you see the pH increases. Well, Luis, the pH still look very good, right? It's around 4 or maybe less than 4.2. I agree with you. Like I said, there is high potential for silage to ferment well, but you can see that does not ferment as well as earlier, right? And this is important because if you don't have a great backing and sealing practice, and you also have less water, the fermentation may not be as good. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then the last topic I'm going to discuss with you today, I'm just going to briefly mention about microbial inoculants. Okay, I'm not going to tell you which inoculants to use. I think it differs from farm to farm, but there are 2 types of inoculants to consider. First, homofermentative microbial inoculants. These are inoculants that traditionally produce lactic acid. And this is very important because lactic acid accumulation reduces pH and the silage gets stable faster. Usually, corn plants are very good with available substrate for bacteria, and fermentation is good. So this type of inoculant would be suggested if you expect issues during early fermentation, or maybe if you are harvesting a crop that is too dry. Okay, so what you expect if you use those type of inoculants? Well, the expected response is, and here we have the control results and the difference for the inoculated silage. So basically the inoculated silage will have slightly lower pH because of the greater accumulation of lactate. It also has less butyrate and lower mold and Clostridia counts. Okay, so there is a benefit depending on your needs. Okay, keep in mind that this meta-analysis was for all crops, not only for corn. And then there is heterofermentative microbial inoculants, or inoculants such as those that contain Lactobacillus buchneri or buchneri, which produce acetic acid. Okay, acetic acid is very important because it actually inhibits yeast and mold proliferation after silage opening. Actually, to me, this is key for corn silage and high moisture corn, especially in areas that will be feeding a lot of silage during the summer. Okay. Well, Luis, why do you like those inoculants? Basically, what happens is at a certain point during fermentation, these inoculants will shift fermentation. We'll start using some of the lactate. So you can see that the lactate is lower when there is inoculant being applied to silage. And then there is greater acetate, and because of that, lower yeast counts. And we can see that the effect on yeast was very important because we also have much greater aerobic stability. If you're not familiar with the term aerobic stability is the time that takes for silage to warm up 5 degrees more than its baseline temperature. Okay, and this is important because basically what happens when you open the silo is yeast and mold start to proliferate, you start consuming lactate, pH increase, and then silage starts deteriorating, which basically there is all those heat reactions. Okay, so that's why we use aerobic stability. So Luis, if I use this inoculant, I can leave silage 500 hours in the floor before feeding. No, you cannot do that. Okay, this is just laboratory data, but it's an indication that the silage shelf life is longer, okay, or will take much longer to be deteriorated. And just to give you a perspective on that, some of those buchneri, not all, okay, they vary drastically actually, they may have greater benefits as fermentation progresses, but you can see that even at 30 days, there is more aerobic stability. Obviously, if you wait 90, 120 days, those numbers will be even better. Okay, and that's because there's more control of the yeast counts and consequently less risk of proliferation of those yeasts and deterioration of silage. With that, I think that there are many factors that affect nutritive value of whole plant corn silage. For those of you that work with sorghum silage, everything I mentioned is true except kernel processing. I know it's very hard to break sorghum berries. Hopefully, one day we will have a way of doing that well. Okay, but maturity plays exactly the same role for sorghum as it does for corn. Okay, so for those of you harvesting corn silage, processing and maturity at harvest remain the most important factors to improve nutritive value of silage. But obviously, you have to consider what's more important to you and your operation to make those decisions and make the best silage possible for your needs. And if possible, consider using inoculants either to boost your initial fermentation or to prevent silage deterioration. But if doing so, my suggestion is try to use research-proven inoculants to make sure that you can have an idea of if they will truly work. There are a lot of different things in the market. Okay, a lot of those we don't know about, right? Maybe they are as good as the other, but we just don't know about. Okay? With that, this is my contact information. If by any chance there is any question that we don't have time to answer today, please feel free to contact me. I will be happy to answer any of your questions. Again, Fred, thanks for the invitation, and I guess we're open for questions.
How tight do you need to set the processor? As folks are using custom folks, what should be a guideline?
Fred, in my opinion, it has to be between 1 and 3 millimeters. Okay, so some years ago, one of those reviews that we showed today, another component of that was kernel processing, not only processed versus unprocessed, but we also compare 1 to 3 millimeters, 4 to 8, and then unprocessed. And if you have those row gaps too open, it's very hard. And even if you think about that, those distance, they are actually smaller than the corn kernels, right? But there are so much material going through those harvester, and a lot of times they are in between forage particles, right? Which kind of helps to alleviate the pressure. So because of that, you need to make sure they are very, very tight. Okay, I'll tell you the numbers I like for particle size as well, but that's something that each operation may have different needs depending on the other forages that they will be feeding, the diets that they feed. Okay, the typical for me would be 3/4 of an inch to an inch particle size, and then very tight processor, preferably close to 1 millimeter.
Very good. Another question that came in with, some herds going to be short on silage. They're considering using corn silage as a green chop. If you're using corn silage as a green chop, any recommendations on that?
Sure, you have to remember that if you're using green chop silage, you don't have the benefit of the initial fermentation on starch digestibility, right? So you should expect slightly lower digestibility than usual, right? And this is important because when you move from a previous year crop to the new year crop, you already have a decrease in starch digestibility because the other crop fermented for 12 months almost, right? So the decrease in starch digestibility will be even greater if you're using green chop. Another thing to consider for this specific year is that for those of you that had drought stress corn, sometimes those plants accumulate more nitrate, okay? Especially if you are harvesting 1 or 2 days after some rain. So, and this is important because nitrate is toxic, not only to cows, but also to people. And usually in silage helps a little bit with that because it decreases the nitrate concentration in silage. So if you're feeding green chop, I would suggest at least send a couple of samples for nitrate just to make sure you are safe with that.
Very good. That I had come in was on the BMR plant, it shows stress differently, or any recommendations on that?
So the BMR plants, they have less lignin, right? So this changes a little bit the physiology of the plant. So sometimes the drought stress could be harder on BMR than conventional plants. Although, to be really honest with you, I think there are some BMR hybrids that are actually outstanding. You know, some years ago, if you remember the 2012 drought, we actually were running a study comparing a BMR, a leafy, and a dual purpose hybrid. And the dual purpose hybrid actually had issues with the drought and the BMR did not, and they were growing the same field, right next to each other. So I think it will depend on the hybrid you have and what you do. However, usually when you have drought stress corn, your harvesting window is shorter because some of those kernels dry down faster. Okay, the BMR kernels, they traditionally dry down faster than conventional hybrids, so maybe even shorter. Okay, so I would pay very close attention to the kernel milk line to make sure you don't miss that gap.
So I was hoping to do it wetter this year. Is that going to cause any problems, or?
How wet would that be?
Well, I got about a week left before I think they want to start chopping, so I'm first on the list. So I got to go out and test it, but I don't see a milk line yet, but I should start seeing one here shortly.
Okay. So what may happen is very often the wet material ferments well. Okay. The issue related to that is if it's extremely wet, and I'm going to call extremely wet less than 25% dry matter, sometimes between 25, 28 could be too, is in bunkers primarily, or in bunkers and superficie type of silos. Basically what happens is some of this water may move down the silo and take some of the nutrients as seepage. So you may lose a little bit of the fermentation with that. Okay, so, but if you are above 28% dry matter, I think you will be fine.
Okay, because it would be better too wet than too dry, wouldn't it?
Yes, except if you're losing a lot of water, because then what happens is some of the water carries the sugars, and the sugars are needed for fermentation by bacteria. So that's the only way that will be worse. And I agree with you. In my opinion, wetter is better than drier.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Luiz, if you any final thoughts or comments?
I guess my only final comment here is, regardless of the type of silage you're making, just be safe. There's a lot going on during silage season. You know, more equipment, more people, more hours, right? So we are often very tired. So please be aware of your surroundings and get home safe.
Very good. Yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go for the final comment was, there's a lot of things that happen in a very short amount of time. Let's be careful as we're building those piles to get that 1 to 3 slope on those drive over piles. When I was a young man, we had upright silos and we were very aware of gas that can be in those silos. Remember that gas does form. I've seen that orange gas around a pit silo and a drive over silo. So all those things, as you said, we need to be aware of as we're starting to pull the material off. Make sure that we're staying away from the edge as we're opening those piles up. But we hope people have a safe as well as a productive silo filling time.